Did the Soviet Union do the most in the Second World War against the Axis powers? Many people argue they do. They lost around 10 million military personnel and around 20 million civilians. In the late 1930s, Stalin launched the Great Purge, and this removed people from the army, the navy, and also the air force who he suspected that weren't loyal to the Soviet Union, and it also impacted civilians as well. And it impacted the Soviet war effort, especially in the Winter War, and also in the first couple of years of the Second World War as well. In 1939, the Germans and the Soviet Union invaded Poland, and this was agreed in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And then in 1941, the Germans launched the invasion of the Soviet Union, called Operation Barbarossa. And the Soviets were warned of this by the British multiple times, and Stalin didn't believe it. And it led to massive miscalculations, Soviet defences weren't fully completed, and many Soviet airfields were destroyed as well, and Soviet aircraft. Due to most of the Soviet Air Force being destroyed, and poor military tactics, and just poor generals in the Soviet army due to the Great Purges, meant that the Soviets couldn't stem the German advances so much. And on top of that, the casualties increased for the Soviets because, firstly, of the Soviet scorched earth policy, which destroyed infrastructure in Soviet-controlled areas that the Germans were about to control, and this meant destroying farmland and just resources for normal civilians to live on, increasing civilian casualties. But on top of that, of course, the Germans were awful to Soviet civilians as well. In the next couple of years, the Soviets fought hard against the Germans, and they got a lot of supplies from the United States and even Britain as well. For example, Operation Uranus wouldn't have been possible without American aid and British aid because a lot of the manoeuvring was done by land-lease vehicles. There were issues with Soviet training, with it not being long enough compared to the British and Americans. However, they did use combined arms effectively, but when the combined arms didn't work so much, they would use attrition to get their way. And they could do this because they had the population and the manpower, but it wasn't the best use of men. However, you got to give it to the Soviets for manufacturing. They produced tens of thousands of tanks, guns, shells, artillery and planes and bullets. However, the equipment wasn't always the best, and the Soviets often lacked sufficient equipment during their campaigns. And another issue was air power. Their pilots were great and they did produce a lot of planes, however they never really gained air supremacy. They got air superiority many of the times, but not air supremacy. And even during the Battle of Berlin, German officials were flying in and out of airfields in Berlin, and then obviously the Soviets captured it and this stopped. But you'd think if they got air superiority and air supremacy, this would have been stopped.